Good morning. I hope you've had enough coffee. And before we get started, I actually would like to start with a pop quiz. I realize you're not all familiar with the video games industry, but I just, wanted to sort of spark your interest with a bit of luck here. So first question, does this figure mean anything to you? What is that your current balance? Nice. Nice. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the global music industry revenue in 2022. Now that you have this as a segue, what do you think is this figure? Is that the games industry? No, sir. That's actually the global film industry. And what by that I mean not box office. I'm not talking about cinema attendance. I'm actually talking about global revenue for the film industry. So distribution platforms, streaming, you name it. $77 billion. The gaming industry, you might have guessed, is a bit more than that. It's actually more than twice the sum of the global music and film industry put together. We're looking at 184 billion with a B dollars for this year. For last year. For this year, the forecast is about 200 billion. So without further ado, I hope I got your attention. Welcome to the game, ladies and gentlemen. What I really want to do today is talk to you about why and how this industry got this big, where it is big, right? And then what you could look forward to as an internet professional. Now, let's get started. The gamers. This used to be the gamers. It's not them anymore. It's actually you. Because believe it or not, the average age of a gamer is actually a lot older than you would think. 76% of gamers is over 18 years old. I would care to venture that most of you are over 18 in this room. And yeah, the average age is actually 35 years old. Even better than that, this actually transcends gender as well. Because 41% of PS4 and PS5 owners is actually female on a global scale. So the age of the game industry that would be catered to kids, teenagers, spending time and money in arcades is long gone. We are fueling this industry today. So where does it come from and where do we stand? The thing is, when the industry started about 40 years ago, there were four key aspects to any given game: exploration, action, strategy, and conflict. And then depending on the amount or the degree of these aspects put together, you could sort of create different genres when it comes to the video games ecosystem, different types of games. Now, as I'm sure you would have guessed, not every video game necessitates online services. Not every game is connected. But it is changing, and it's becoming more and more connected. So when it comes to video games with an online component, some of them are very latency sensitive. Because effectively, somebody who's based in South Africa wants to be playing a game with somebody who's in, Spain, whilst the others are also playing from the US. How do you actually cater to such an ecosystem? And the answer to that is really by making sure that you talk a lot with video games developers and publishers out there alike. Because there are a wide variety of tools that you need to take into account if you want to work with games. It's not your traditional, day-to-day, run-of-the-mill operation. There are such things as game engines. There are such things as limitations set by game engines. There are such things as geographical limitations as well as restrictions imposed onto you by whatever matchmaking system is used by the developer. And the list goes on. But without further ado, let's take a look at the history of it all. The market. As mentioned, the industry started out about 40 years ago. And when gaming was created, what really sort of made it boom was the arcade centers. I don't know if you remember those, where you would go to these places, these parlors basically, where you would put a coin in an arcade system and just enjoy whatever game. The thing is, those games back in the day were designed to make you spend more money. That's why the music was there to confuse you and disorientate you, as well as having a very, very aggressive leveling system. Obviously, with the rise of the console market, the PC market, personal computing, things have changed progressively. But numbers-wise, based on our friends from Convoy, they're a venture capitalist, well, this sadly does not go back 40 years, but you do get to see that from its humble beginnings of $20 billion, we're now at 184, and the forecast for 2027 is 283. The theory is that we're going to be reaching 300 billion by 2030. The truth of the matter is that might be even faster, because it will depend on you. It will depend on the tech, on the online, on the internet industry. That will have a strong impact on the growth and the speed of that growth for the industry. Now, a pivoting point actually happened around 2009 in the gaming industry. Before that, if you wanted to create a game and release it for a console, and you needed to use a game engine, like for instance Unreal. The Unreal game engine is an engine that was created by a company called Epic Games. You probably have heard of Epic Games because you've heard of Fortnite. Whether you play kids or you play kids, whether you play Fortnite or you have kids who play Fortnite, you've heard of Fortnite, and therefore you've heard of Epic Games. So anyway, Unreal, back in the day, would charge you $1.5 million per boxed license to create a game. So in other words, if you have a studio that's working on 2 games, you needed 2 licenses at 1.5 million each. All right? But then around 2009, a company called Unity came and democratized the industry. And effectively, the indie community of game developers was born out of that. Because Unity was like, no. If you want a game engine to create a game, it's going to cost you $1,000. Now, of course, a lot of people from very big companies left a lot of these very big companies that you all have heard of and created their small studios, and the rise of the indie sector really, went very fast. Another thing that you might want to take into account is 2007. Does anybody remember what was released in 2007? Exactly. The iPhone has had a massive impact on gaming because it effectively cemented a new platform for the entertainment channel, aka mobile gaming. The birth of the mobile app store. And that's why, effectively, if you combine the rise of the mobile gaming ecosystem with the democratization of game engines, you see an exponential, crazy increase that has occurred between 2009 and now, where the industry literally multiplied itself by 3. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, there are bigger markets everywhere around the world. The biggest market in the world, by far, is Asia, followed by North America, followed by Europe, followed by LATAM, and then followed by Middle East and Africa. These are the biggest countries in those markets on a global scale, that's the top 10. As I'm sure you can imagine, China is the biggest simply because of the sheer amount of people. As a matter of fact, if you look at the amount of gamers around the world, you'll see that Asia Pacific has a little more than, half of the global gaming population, which is 3.2 billion people. Considering the slide that we saw earlier from the esteemed lady who spoke about cybercrimes, where we're basically at about 8.02 billion people on Earth, 3.2 billion of us now are playing games. But here's where it gets interesting. Whilst Asia Pacific is obviously the biggest one by far, you can also see that there are markets where the amount of players is superior to those in, say, North America, which is the second biggest market in the world. And yet, the market share, the revenue generated, is still quite a bit low. However, if you look at the year-on-year growth, for instance, in Middle East and Africa, you can see that the year-on-year growth is actually quite phenomenal. And it's actually going to grow even faster. We will talk a bit more about Africa and the Middle East after this, but just try to take that in. The amount of players does not necessarily reflect the revenue that can be generated. But it does play a role, as we'll see right after. The second biggest market in the world in terms of growth is LATAM. LATAM has been growing tremendously, and, once upon a time, people focused on Brazil and Brazil alone. Today, it's a bit more complex than that. We'll talk about it afterwards as well. Now, when it comes to the graphs that I just showed you, these are the more significant markets in the world, the more significant countries in the world, if you will. That being said, if I'm looking at this graph right now, I see that, for instance, we are missing quite a bit of information when it comes to the Middle East and Africa. Africa actually is the fastest growing market in the world when it comes to video games, followed by Saudi. We'll talk about this afterwards. Now, let's talk about perspectives for tomorrow. What does that all mean? This is the status quo. We spoke about numbers, we spoke about money, we spoke about the biggest markets. Let's talk about the REMs. So as mentioned, Middle East and Africa. Africa actually has an amazing amount of players that's growing every day thanks to 5 markets. The first one is South Africa. The second one is Ghana. The third one is Nigeria. The fourth one is Kenya. And then the fifth one is Ethiopia. These 5 countries could actually really propel the continent when it comes to generating a lot more revenue. Because at this moment in time, the market is still very open, right? Nigeria pioneered mobile payment back in the day. South Africa is seeing this amazing effervescence of birth, if you will, of dev studios left and right. The problem is that not enough content is originating from Africa itself, because effectively there's really just one game publisher there. So whilst a lot of the dev studios are being commissioned to create games for publishers, Africa is not necessarily being put on the map, when it comes to revenue generation. So once we have more game publishers coming in, we will see an absolute growth that will actually probably take over Europe very quickly. Now, as mentioned before, the Middle East and Africa actually is really largely thanks to 2 territories. The first one is Africa, the second one is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the public investment fund in Saudi, basically the royal family, spent $38 billion into creating a gaming ecosystem. This year, they just bought a really, really big and important player in the gaming industry, a company called Scopely. They bought it for $4.9 billion. This is a company that has created some of the biggest IP-driven, IP, not Internet Protocol, IP, intellectual property, IP-driven games based on things like Monopoly, Scrabble, all that. So these are all online games. These are all interconnected games where you have players having to, in real time, interact with one another. And it's only the beginning, because through all of these investments, Saudi now has a very, very, I don't want to use the term aggressive, but a very active group that is there to simply accelerate that ecosystem and that growth. And a lot of people from around here are moving to Saudi every day now, because obviously some of the advantages can be, well, quite considerable. Talking about LATAM, Brazil is obviously the biggest gaming market in Latin America. But that is slowly going to be changing, because there is a very, very clear trend in countries like Peru, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico, right? Where development studios are being commissioned every day because the skill set is extremely high. But they do need the production value of the West. And as a result, more and more content is originating, more and more publishers are being created there and developers, and more players are actually showing up, because payment solutions are not a problem anymore. They used to be. Payment solutions used to actually drive or break even a market for the gaming industry, because not everybody has a credit card. Not everybody has a bank account with a currency that you can actually migrate from A to B outside of the country. So a lot of alternative payment solutions had to be created in order for these territories to flourish and grow even more. So, excuse me. So the rapid emerging markets are definitely to be looked at. And what that means for you, we will talk about in the end. We'll talk about the key takeaways. Then let's talk about legislation. Next year, the Digital Markets Act is going to come into play. If you don't know what that is, I'm sure you'll find out soon enough, because there's even going to be, I believe, a speaker who will cover legislation and the impact it has on what we do. When it comes to DMA, this is basically going to make sure that gatekeepers of digital content will have to allow sideload and download of content outside of their ecosystems. Think about it. That means Apple, the App Store, as you rightfully pointed out earlier, sir, with the birth of the iPhone. Google, with the Google Play Store. All of these will not be able to tell game companies anymore, you have to go through us to make money. So whether it's in-app purchasing, whether it's, downloadable additional content that you can purchase at a premium, all of that, you can take your consumers, you can take your players to a different environment and not have to incur the payment or the percentage that these platforms would actually, apply onto you. That is going to actually mean that there's a lot of things that will be changing next year. We'll talk about it in the key takeaways as well. Transmedia is finally here. Who here has seen the new Mario movie? Good man. If you haven't, you should go and check it out. Because you know what? Even as an adult, it's actually super entertaining. And guess what? This is a direct result of the end of the streaming war. Once upon a time, Netflix and Amazon and HBO and all these, Disney, were really fighting over content. That's done. It's over. Now what they're trying to do is actually really consolidate their activities and tapping into, another art form that is simply part of that very same environment. And that will happen even more because media convergence has become a reality. Mario, which generated, $1.3 billion since it just got released. $1.3 billion is based on a video game. The Last of Us, one of the most popular TV series on HBO, is based on a video game. And the list goes on. Movie IP has been used in video games since the 90s. We've all played Indiana Jones and Superman and James Bond and all of these sorts of titles back in the day. But today, because of this added, ability to engage with fans across multiple spectra, right? It actually means phenomenal changes. Warner Brothers released the Hogwarts Legacy, a game which is based on Harry Potter, in less than